The distant sound of thunder rolled across the sky as Selena Odell stared up at the darkening clouds from the porch of her modest ranch house. She had been in Wickenburg, Arizona, for less than a month, and already the untamed territory was testing her resolve in ways she never imagined possible. The year was 1882, and while most women her age were safely settled in the East with husbands and children, 24-year-old Selena had chosen a different path, one that led her west after her parents' passing left her with little more than determination and the deed to a small parcel of land. Miss Odell, the weathered voice of her ranch hand Tobias, pulled her attention from the threatening sky. "Those clouds don't look friendly. We should get the cattle to higher ground." Selena nodded, gathering her skirts as she descended the porch steps. The air held that peculiar stillness that preceded a storm, heavy with the scent of dust and approaching rain. She had heard stories of the flash floods that could transform dry creek beds into raging rivers within minutes, but seeing the signs herself sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I'll help you with the eastern herd," she called to Tobias, ignoring his look of protest. Selena had learned quickly that earning respect in the West meant working alongside her hands, not watching from the safety of the house. As they rode out, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall, striking the parched earth with audible taps. What had been a distant rumble of thunder was now directly overhead, and lightning split the sky in jagged white lines. The cattle were already restless, sensing the change in weather with an instinct that humans could only envy. "Miss, we need to hurry," Tobias shouted over the intensifying storm. "The Hassaamper River rises fast in weather like this." Selena urged her horse forward, helping to guide the nervous cattle toward the rising ground to the north of her property. The rain was falling in sheets now, stinging her face and soaking through her clothes until she felt the weight of them against her skin. The usually dry landscape was transforming before her eyes, water beginning to pool and flow in channels that had been nothing but cracked earth hours before. They had nearly reached the designated safety zone when a sound like a freight train drew Selena's attention to the west. A wall of water at least 6 feet high was rushing down the riverbed that bordered her property, carrying debris and uprooted vegetation in its powerful current. "Tobias," she screamed, pointing toward the approaching danger. "Get the cattle up the hill." But her warning came too late. The flash flood had already reached the lower portion of her herd. Cattle bellowed in panic as the churning water swept several of them away. Selena watched in horror as Tobias fought to control his own horse while still attempting to save what remained of the herd. "Get to higher ground, miss," he yelled back at her. "I'll handle this." Selena hesitated, torn between helping and heeding his advice. In that moment of indecision, her horse reared, startled by a particularly loud crack of thunder. She tumbled backward, landing hard on the increasingly muddy ground. Her horse bolted, and before she could get to her feet, Selena felt the first rush of floodwater against her legs. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to stand, but the force of the water knocked her back down. She was being pulled toward the main channel of the flood, where the water ran deeper and faster. Grabbing desperately at anything solid, her hands found only mud and loose stones that gave way under her grip. "Help!" she cried out, but her voice was lost in the roar of the flood and the continuing storm. The current dragged her downstream, tumbling her body like a rag doll. Selena fought to keep her head above water, gasping for breath whenever the opportunity presented itself. Her lungs burned, and her limbs felt leaden as the cold water sapped her strength. Just as despair began to overtake her, her body slammed into something solid. Pain shot through her side, but the collision had stopped her downstream journey. Selena found herself wedged against a large rock formation that jutted out from the bank, creating a small island in the midst of the raging flood. Using the last of her strength, she pulled herself higher onto the rocks, away from the grabbing fingers of the floodwater. There she collapsed, coughing and shaking, her clothing plastered to her body, and her long auburn hair a sodden mass against her back. The rain continued to fall, though less violently now, and Selena took stock of her situation. The rock formation was stable but isolated, surrounded by the rushing floodwaters on all sides. Tobias was nowhere to be seen, likely still dealing with the cattle if he hadn't been swept away himself. Her home was out of sight, and she had no way of knowing how long the flood would last or how long she would be stranded. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Selena's shivering became more pronounced. The storm had cooled the desert air considerably, and her wet clothing offered no protection. She huddled against the rock, trying to conserve what warmth remained in her body, and prayed that someone would come looking for her once the worst of the flood had passed. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she drifted in and out of a daze. The sound of the rushing water became a constant background noise, almost hypnotic in its consistency. It wasn't until she heard a different sound, the splash of something large entering the water, that Selena roused herself fully. Through the light rain that still fell, she could make out a figure on horseback, deliberately guiding his mount into the flood. The horse moved cautiously, testing each step before committing its weight, but the rider was clearly determined to reach her. "Hold on, madam," a deep voice called out. "I'm coming to get you." Selena sat up straighter, hope flaring in her chest. The rider wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the rain, and even from a distance, she could see the determined set of his shoulders as he navigated the dangerous waters. The horse snorted and tossed its head as the water rose to its chest, but the rider kept it moving forward with firm hands and reassuring words that Selena couldn't quite make out. As they drew closer, she could see that both horse and rider were powerful figures, the horse a sturdy palomino with a pale golden coat, and the rider a broad-shouldered man dressed in the practical clothing of a working cowboy. "Can you stand?" he called when he was within 20 feet of her rock island. Selena nodded and pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the pain in her side where she had struck the rock. "Yes," she called back, her voice weaker than she would have liked. The man guided his horse right up to the edge of her rocky refuge, then held out a gloved hand. "Take my hand," he instructed. "I'll pull you up behind me." Selena hesitated only briefly before reaching out. His grip was strong and sure as he locked his fingers around her wrist. With a strength that made the action seem effortless, he pulled her from the rock and onto his horse in one fluid motion, settling her behind him. "Hold on to me," he said, and Selena wrapped her arms around his waist without question, feeling the solid warmth of him even through his damp clothing. As the horse began to make its way back through the floodwaters, the man spoke over his shoulder. "Name's Keegan Forrester. I was checking my own property line when I saw the flood hit, followed it downstream and spotted you on those rocks." "Selena Odell," she replied, her teeth chattering slightly. "I own the 00 Ranch. Thank you for coming for me." Keegan's back stiffened slightly under her hands. "The 00, that's your place." There was something in his tone that Selena couldn't quite identify, but before she could question it, he continued. "Let's get you somewhere dry and warm first. We can talk more later." The journey through the floodwaters seemed to take an eternity, though in reality, it was likely no more than 15 minutes before they reached higher ground. Keegan's horse, clearly well trained for difficult conditions, never faltered despite carrying double its usual load. Once they were safely away from the flood, Keegan urged his horse into a faster pace. "My cabin's closer than town," he explained. "We'll get you warmed up there, and I can send word to your ranch hands once the rain stops completely." Selena wanted to protest, to insist that they try to reach her own home, but exhaustion and cold were taking their toll. She found herself leaning more heavily against Keegan's back, drawing warmth from his solid presence, and nodded against his shoulder in agreement. The rain had finally ceased by the time they reached a small but well-built cabin nestled in a clearing among pine trees. A corral stood empty to one side, and a modest barn completed the homestead. It was simple but maintained with obvious care. Keegan dismounted first, then reached up to help Selena down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he caught her arm to steady her. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Let's get you inside." The interior of the cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace at one end. A narrow bed occupied one corner, a small table with 2 chairs another, and a rudimentary kitchen area completed the space. Despite its simplicity, it was clean and organized, not what Selena had expected from a bachelor's quarters. Keegan immediately moved to the fireplace, where embers still glowed from an earlier fire. He added kindling and logs with practiced efficiency, and soon flames were dancing upward, casting warmth and light throughout the cabin. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, moving to a trunk at the foot of his bed. "I don't have anything that will fit you properly, but dry is better than proper right now." He pulled out a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that would clearly swallow her whole. "There's a screen in the corner you can change behind. I'll make some coffee to warm you from the inside." Selena took the offered clothing with a murmured thanks and moved behind the wooden screen. As she peeled off her sodden dress and undergarments, she could hear Keegan moving around the cabin, the clank of a coffee pot and the soft thuds of cupboard doors marking his progress. The flannel shirt hung almost to her knees, and she had to roll the sleeves up several times to free her hands. The trousers were hopeless without a belt, so she left them aside, the shirt providing adequate coverage for modesty's sake. She wrung out her hair as best she could, and used a small towel Keegan had thoughtfully hung over the screen to dry it further. When she emerged, Keegan had his back to her, giving her a moment to observe him unnoticed. He had removed his hat and coat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He was tall, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living, and there was an economy to his movements that spoke of confidence and capability. He turned as if sensing her presence, and Selena was struck by the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were a striking blue, set in a face that had been weathered by sun and wind but remained handsome in a rugged way. A day's growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and there was a small scar just above his right eyebrow that lent character to his features. "The coffee's almost ready," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance in his oversized shirt before quickly looking away. "There's a blanket on the chair there if you want it." Selena moved to the chair and wrapped the offered blanket around her shoulders, settling near the fire's warmth. "Thank you," she said again, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "You saved my life out there." Keegan shrugged as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Selena shook her head. "Not anyone would have ridden into a flash flood to rescue a stranger." He handed her one of the cups, and she wrapped her still cold fingers around it gratefully. "You're not exactly a stranger, Miss Odell. Everyone in Wickenburg knows about the woman from back east who took over the 00." There was that tone again, something hiding beneath his words that she couldn't quite place. Curiosity overcame politeness, and she asked directly, "Is there something about me or my ranch that bothers you, Mr. Forrester?" Keegan paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips, then sighed and took the other chair. "Not you personally, madam, but the double O and my family have. History." Selena frowned, trying to recall if her uncle had ever mentioned the Forrester name in his infrequent letters before his death had left her the property. "What kind of history?" "The kind that involves property lines and water rights," Keegan replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Your uncle and my father disagreed about where exactly the boundary between our properties lay, specifically the section that includes access to Sycamore Creek. It never came to legal action, but there was bad blood." Understanding dawned on Selena. "And now you've rescued the enemy," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the revelation. Something in Keegan's expression softened, and one corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I wouldn't go that far. Besides, I figure saving you puts me ahead in whatever feud they had going." The unexpected humor caught Selena by surprise, and she laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the cabin. "I suppose it does at that." Outside, the light was beginning to fade as evening approached. Keegan rose and lit a lamp, then moved to the window to peer out at the weather. "Rain's stopped completely now, but those floodwaters won't recede until morning at the earliest. You'll have to stay here tonight." Selena nodded, having already reached the same conclusion herself. Under normal circumstances, the propriety of staying unchaperoned in a man's cabin would have been scandalous, but these were hardly normal circumstances. "I'm worried about my ranch hand, Tobias," she admitted. "He was trying to get the cattle to higher ground when I was swept away." "Tobias Jenkins?" Keegan asked, and when Selena nodded, he continued, "He's been working ranches in this territory for 20 years. If anyone could handle himself in a flood, it's him. But I can ride to your ranch first thing in the morning to check, once the waters have gone down some." Selena felt relief wash over her. "Thank you. Again." Keegan acknowledged her thanks with a nod, then turned to practical matters. "Are you hungry? I don't have much in the way of fancy food, but there's stew left from yesterday that I can heat up." The mention of food reminded Selena that she hadn't eaten since breakfast, and her stomach rumbled audibly in response. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but Keegan just smiled and moved to the small stove where a covered pot sat. As he worked to reheat the stew, Selena found herself studying him again. There was something compelling about Keegan Forrester, something beyond the fact that he had risked his life to save hers. Perhaps it was the quiet competence with which he moved, or the way his initial reserve had gradually softened into something more approachable. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to fill the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "All my life," Keegan replied, stirring the stew. "My father staked his claim in '52 during the gold rush. He didn't find much gold, but he found land worth keeping. When he died 3 years ago, I took over." "I'm sorry about your father," Selena said softly. Keegan glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "And I'm sorry about your uncle. Whatever disagreements were between us, Jacob Odell was a fair man in most dealings." The stew was ready, and Keegan filled 2 bowls, handing one to Selena along with a spoon. The food was simple but hearty chunks of beef and vegetables in a rich broth that tasted of herbs and spices Selena couldn't quite identify. "This is delicious," she said after her first bite, surprised by the depth of flavor. "My mother's recipe," Keegan explained. "She taught me to cook before she passed. Said no man should rely on a woman to keep from starving." Selena smiled at that. "She sounds like a wise woman. My mother taught me to ride before she taught me to sew. Said a woman should always have means to get herself out of trouble if need be." "Seems like you had that in common then," Keegan observed. Independent thinking. They ate in companionable silence after that, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. When they had finished, Keegan took the dishes to a basin of water he had heated on the stove, washing them with the same efficient movements that characterized everything he did. Fatigue was beginning to set in, and Selena found herself stifling a yawn behind her hand. Keegan noticed and gestured toward the bed. "You should get some rest. You've had quite a day." Selena looked at the narrow bed, then back at Keegan with uncertainty. "I can't take your bed. The chair will be fine for me." Keegan shook his head firmly. "I won't hear of it. I've slept in worse places than a chair by a fire. Besides, you're injured." At his words, Selena became aware again of the dull ache in her side where she had struck the rock. She hadn't mentioned it, but somehow he had noticed. "It's just a bruise," she protested. "All the more reason you need proper rest," Keegan countered. "The bed's yours tonight, Miss Odell. I insist." His tone brooked no argument, and truthfully, Selena was too tired to put up much of a fight. She nodded in acquiescence and moved to the bed, still wrapped in the blanket he had given her earlier. The bed smelled of pine and something uniquely masculine that she assumed was Keegan himself. The pillow was flat but comfortable, and as she settled onto the straw-filled mattress, exhaustion overtook her almost immediately. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Keegan setting a chair near the fire, his profile outlined in golden light as he stared thoughtfully into the flames. When Selena woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the cabin's single window. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a brief surge of panic before the events of the previous day rushed back to her. The flood, the rescue, Keegan Forrester. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her side, and looked around the cabin. Keegan was nowhere to be seen, but the fire had been built up recently, and she could smell coffee brewing on the stove. Her dress and undergarments, now dry, had been placed carefully over the screen in the corner, well away from where she might see him if he had been watching her sleep. Selena rose, taking the blanket with her behind the screen to dress. Her clothes still held the faint scent of river mud, but they were dry and wearable. She did her best to arrange her hair without a mirror, twisting it into a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and emerged feeling more like herself than she had since the flood. The door opened as she was pouring herself a cup of coffee, and Keegan entered, carrying a bucket of fresh water. He stopped short at the sight of her up and dressed, then nodded a greeting. "Morning," he said, setting the bucket down near the wash basin. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Selena admitted, "but alive, thanks to you. Have you been outside long? I didn't hear you leave." "Wanted to check the flood levels," Keegan explained, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "It's receded some, but the main channels are still running high. I'd say another few hours before it's safe to cross to your property." Disappointment must have shown on her face because he added, "I can see part of your eastern pasture from the ridge. There's cattle up there, which means at least some of your herd made it to high ground." Relief washed over Selena at this news. "And Tobias, did you see any sign of him?" Keegan shook his head. "No, but that doesn't mean anything bad. The ridge only gives a view of part of your property. He could be anywhere, dealing with the cattle or checking damages." Selena nodded, trying to hold on to hope that her loyal ranch hand had survived the flood. "What about your own property? Any damage?" "Some fencing down along the creek, nothing that can't be fixed." Keegan poured himself coffee and leaned against the small kitchen table. "Are you hungry? I can make breakfast." "Please let me," Selena offered. "It's the least I can do after all your help." Keegan looked like he might protest, but then nodded and gestured toward the small pantry. "Help yourself. I need to check on my horse anyway." After he had gone out again, Selena took stock of his provisions. She found flour, salt, a small amount of sugar, eggs that must have been gathered that morning, and a slab of bacon. Simple fare, but she could work with it. By the time Keegan returned, she had biscuits baking in the small oven and bacon frying in a cast-iron skillet. The domestic scene struck her as oddly comfortable, as if they had done this dance many times before instead of having just met under life-threatening circumstances. "Smells good," Keegan commented, washing his hands in the basin before joining her at the stove. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble," Selena assured him. "Cooking is one of the few traditional womanly arts that I actually enjoy." This drew a smile from Keegan, transforming his usually serious face into something that made Selena's heart skip a beat unexpectedly. "And the others?" he asked. "Gardening I can manage, though I'm better with vegetables than flowers. Sewing is tolerable for necessity but not pleasure. And I absolutely detest embroidery," Selena admitted with a small laugh. "What do you enjoy then, besides cooking?" Keegan asked, seeming genuinely interested. "Riding," Selena replied without hesitation. "Reading, learning new things, and ranching, though I'm still learning that particular skill." Keegan's expression became more serious at the mention of ranching. "It's not an easy life, especially out here. Water's scarce, the weather's unpredictable, and the profit margins are thin at best. What made you decide to take on your uncle's ranch instead of selling it?" The question was direct but not unkind, and Selena considered her answer as she removed the biscuits from the oven. "After my parents died, I had few options in Philadelphia. I could marry for security, become someone's companion or governess, or try to make my own way. When I received word of Uncle Jacob's death and the inheritance, it seemed like a sign." She placed the bacon on a plate and divided it between them, adding biscuits to each plate before continuing. "I've always been drawn to open spaces and independence. The idea of building something of my own, even if it's difficult, appealed to me more than fitting myself into the narrow expectations back east." They sat at the small table, and Keegan considered her words as he broke open a biscuit, steam rising from its center. "Most people coming west have romantic notions that get crushed in the first year," he said finally, "but you don't strike me as the type to give up easily." "I'm not," Selena confirmed, "though yesterday was certainly a test of my resolve." "A test you passed," Keegan pointed out. "You survived until help came, which is more than can be said for many in flash floods." There was respect in his voice that warmed Selena more than the coffee in her cup. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. "Your uncle," Keegan said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Did he ever mention the dispute between our families in his letters?" Selena shook her head. "No, his correspondence was infrequent and brief. He mentioned having neighbors, but never by name or with any specific complaints." Keegan seemed to consider this. "The dispute was over a bend in Sycamore Creek that creates a natural pool. Both our properties border it, and both of us claim it based on different surveys. During dry years, it's one of the few reliable water sources that doesn't dry up." "And this caused bad blood between our families?" Selena asked, trying to understand. "Water is life out here," Keegan explained simply. "Men have killed for less than a steady water source for their cattle." The gravity of his words wasn't lost on Selena. "What do you propose we do about it now?" Keegan's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by her direct approach. "You're asking my opinion. You know the land better than I do," Selena pointed out. "And you've demonstrated that you're not the type to let old grudges determine your actions." "If you were, I'd likely still be stranded on those rocks." A hint of a smile touched Keegan's lips. "Fair point." He took a sip of his coffee, considering. "I propose we share it, Share it, Selena repeated. Build a fence down the middle if you want, but the pool is big enough for both our herds to water. Set specific days even, if that makes it more official. But fighting over it seems foolish when there's enough for both, at least most years. The practical solution impressed Selena. It was fair, sensible, and acknowledged the reality of their situation without ego or posturing. I think that's an excellent idea, Mr. Forrester. Keegan, he corrected. If we're going to be neighbors sharing water rights, we might as well use first names. Keegan, Selena agreed with a smile. And you should call me Selena. Something shifted in the air between them. A formality dropped and replaced with the beginnings of what might become friendship or perhaps something more, given the way Selena's pulse quickened when their eyes met. After breakfast, Keegan suggested they check the flood levels again, and Selena was glad for the opportunity to stretch her legs and see the situation for herself. They walked together to a ridge that offered a view of both their properties, the land still glistening with rainwater under the morning sun. The main channel of the flood had indeed receded significantly, though water still flowed where there had been only dry creek beds before. In the distance, Selena could make out the roof of her ranch house, thankfully still intact, and the figures of cattle grazing on higher ground. Look there, Keegan pointed toward the eastern section of her property. Someone's moving on horseback. Could be your man Tobias. Selena squinted in the direction he indicated and felt a surge of relief when she recognized the distinctive way Tobias sat a horse. It is him. He's alive. The joy in her voice brought a smile to Keegan's face. Told you he was too experienced to let a little flood take him down. A little flood? Selena arched an eyebrow at him. Is that what you call it? Keegan shrugged, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Compared to the one in 75, yes. That one took out half the buildings in Lower Wickenburg. Selena shook her head in wonder at the casual way he referenced such destruction. Life in the West was certainly different from what she had known in Philadelphia. I think we can cross safely in another hour or so, Keegan estimated, looking at the receding waters. I'll take you home on horseback, then come back for my wagon later to bring your dress and things. My dress? Selena looked down at herself in confusion. The one you were wearing yesterday, Keegan clarified. It's hanging in the barn. I washed it early this morning, but it hasn't had time to dry properly yet. The thought of this capable cowboy washing her muddy dress by hand brought a flush to Selena's cheeks. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Wanted to, Keegan replied simply. Seemed like the right thing to do. As they made their way back to the cabin to prepare for the journey to her ranch, Selena found herself studying Keegan Forrester with new eyes. He was unlike any man she had known in Philadelphia, straightforward, where they had been calculated, genuine where they had been concerned with appearances. There was a strength to him that had nothing to do with his physical capabilities, and everything to do with his character. And when he had ridden his horse into that flood to reach her, he had called her his to rescue a simple turn of phrase, perhaps, but one that had lodged in her heart and refused to leave. True to Keegan's prediction, they were able to cross to Selena's property within the hour. The journey was still hazardous in places, with muddy ground threatening to trap the horses' hooves and occasional debris blocking their path. But Keegan navigated the obstacles with the same calm confidence he had shown during the flood itself. As they approached the 00 Ranch, Selena felt a curious mixture of relief at returning home and disappointment that her time with Keegan was coming to an end. The sight of Tobias riding out to meet them, however, pushed those conflicted feelings aside for the moment. Miss Odell. The older man called, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. Thank the Lord you're alive. When that flood took you, I feared the worst. Mr. Forrester found me stranded on some rocks downstream, Selena explained as Keegan helped her down from his horse. He saved my life. Tobias turned to Keegan, extending his hand. Then you have my eternal gratitude, sir. This ranch would be lost without Miss Odell's determination. Keegan shook the offered hand. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone would have succeeded, Tobias countered, echoing Selena's earlier sentiment. The flood took 3 of our hands when they tried to rescue cattle from the lower pasture. We found 2 of them this morning, alive but battered. The 3rd is still missing. The news sobered all of them, a stark reminder of how fortunate Selena had been. We should organize a search party, she said immediately. Every hour he's missing decreases his chances. Already done, miss, Tobias assured her. Mr. Patterson from the neighboring ranch brought 5 of his men to help. They're searching the southern section now. Keegan straightened in his saddle. I'll join them, he decided. I know the terrain well, especially where the flood would have carried anyone swept away. Selena looked up at him, concern evident in her expression. You've already done so much. One more hand in the search could make the difference, Keegan replied simply. He turned to Tobias. Where should I meet them? As Tobias gave directions, Selena found herself admiring Keegan's immediate willingness to help, even for people he barely knew. It spoke to a generosity of spirit that was as attractive as his more visible qualities. Be careful, she told him when Tobias had finished. The ground is still treacherous. Keegan nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I will. Take care of yourself, Selena. That bruise on your side might need looking at by a proper doctor. Before she could respond, he had tipped his hat and ridden off in the direction Tobias had indicated, leaving Selena staring after him with a peculiar ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her injury. Tobias cleared his throat, drawing her attention back to him. Seems like a good man, he observed, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes shrewd. He is, Selena agreed, suddenly self-conscious. He showed me nothing but kindness and respect. Tobias nodded, apparently satisfied. Let's get you to the house, miss. You look like you could use some rest, and I need to tell you about the damage to the property. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Selena and her remaining hands worked to assess and repair the flood damage. 2 sections of fencing had been washed away completely. The chicken coop had been destroyed, though most of the chickens had somehow survived by roosting in trees, and the veranda steps had been torn from the main house. They had lost 15 head of cattle, and the missing ranch hand, young Billy Foster, had been found dead 2 miles downstream, caught in a tangle of debris. The loss cast a pall over the ranch, and Selena insisted on paying for a proper burial in the Wickenburg cemetery. Billy had been only 19, eager to prove himself and quick to volunteer for any task, no matter how difficult. His death was a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of the territory she had chosen to make her home. Keegan had stayed to help with the search for Billy, and had been the one to find his body. He had handled the grim task with dignity and respect, and had personally delivered the news to Selena before helping to bring the body back to the ranch. After that, he had returned to his own property to deal with his own flood damage, though not before ensuring that Selena had everything she needed. She had seen him only briefly since then, once when he had returned with her washed and dried dress, and once when he had ridden over with 2 of his hands to help repair the section of fencing that bordered their properties. Each time, there had been a warmth in his eyes when he looked at her that suggested his interest went beyond mere neighborly concern, but the demands of their respective ranches had prevented any meaningful conversation. A week after the flood, Selena decided it was time to address the water rights issue they had discussed. With the worst of the repairs behind her, she saddled her replacement horse. Her original mount had never returned after bolting during the flood, and rode toward the disputed bend in Sycamore Creek. The land was beginning to dry out under the relentless Arizona sun, though evidence of the flood was still visible in debris caught in tree branches and new channels carved into the earth. As she approached the creek, Selena could see why the pool formed by the bend would be valuable. It was deeper than the surrounding stream bed, with clear water that reflected the blue sky above. To her surprise, Keegan was already there, hammering a post into the ground near the water's edge. He looked up at the sound of her horse's approach, pushing his hat back to reveal a face that had become even more tanned in the days since their first meeting. "Selena," he greeted her, setting down his hammer. "I was wondering when you might make it out this way." Selena dismounted, tying her horse to a nearby tree before approaching him. "I see you've started on the fence already." Keegan nodded, gesturing to the line of posts he had placed. "Thought I'd get a head start. The sooner we have this settled, the better for both our herds." Selena examined his work, noting that the posts created a division that gave equal access to the water on both sides. "It looks fair to me," she approved. "Though I'm surprised you didn't wait for me to be here before starting." "I trust you," Keegan said simply. "And I figured you had enough on your hands with the repairs to your ranch." The statement shouldn't have affected her as strongly as it did, but those 3 words, "I trust you," resonated with Selena in a way few others ever had. Trust was a rare commodity in the West, where disputes over land, water, and cattle could turn deadly in an instant. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "That means more than you might know." Something shifted in Keegan's expression, a softening around the eyes that made her heart rate increase. He took a step toward her, closing some of the distance between them. "How's your side healing?" he asked, his voice lower than before. "Better," Selena replied, suddenly aware of how alone they were by the creek, with only the sound of water and birdsong surrounding them. "Dr. Wilkins said it was just bruising, as you thought." Keegan nodded, seeming relieved. "And your ranch hand?" "The funeral for Billy Foster was yesterday, wasn't it?" "Yes," Selena confirmed, touched that he had remembered. "It was a simple service, but most of the town turned out. He was well liked." "Loss is part of life out here," Keegan observed, his expression somber. "Doesn't make it any easier to bear, though." "No," Selena agreed softly. "It doesn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of recent events hanging between them. Then Keegan seemed to shake himself, returning to the practical present. "Would you like to help with the fence?" "I could use an extra pair of hands." Selena smiled, grateful for the shift in mood. "I'd be happy to, though I should warn you that my fence-building skills are still developing." This drew a chuckle from Keegan. "Everyone has to start somewhere. Come on, I'll show you how to set a post properly." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side, Keegan teaching and Selena learning the intricacies of fence construction. It was hard, physical work that left Selena's hands blistered and her back aching, but there was satisfaction in seeing the tangible results of their labor. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became more intense, and they took a break in the shade of a cottonwood tree that grew near the creek. Keegan produced a canteen of water and a small bundle that turned out to contain bread and cheese, a simple lunch that he willingly shared. "You came prepared," Selena observed, accepting a piece of the crusty bread. "Always do," Keegan replied, settling back against the tree trunk. "Never know how long a job will take or what might come up while you're out." "A lesson I'm still learning," Selena admitted. In Philadelphia, one never had to worry about being stranded without provisions. "Philadelphia must seem very far away now," Keegan commented, studying her face. Selena considered this. In distance, yes, in time. She paused, trying to find the right words. Sometimes it feels like another life entirely, one lived by a different person. Other times, something will remind me of home. The scent of rain on hot ground is surprisingly similar to the smell after a summer thunderstorm in the city, and it's as if I never left. Keegan nodded in understanding. My father used to talk about Boston that way. Said he could go years without thinking of it, then catch a glimpse of something, a particular shade of red brick, or the way light hit water at sunset, and suddenly be right back in his childhood. You've never been east? Selena asked, curious about this man who had spent his entire life in the territory. Keegan shook his head. Never had reason to go. Everything I need or want is here. The simple statement carried a weight of contentment that Selena found herself envying. To be so certain of one's place in the world was a gift she was still searching for. What about you? Keegan asked after a moment. Do you miss the East? The comforts, the society? Selena thought carefully before answering. I miss certain things. Hot baths whenever I want them. The library with its thousands of books. Some of the people I knew. She looked out at the vast landscape surrounding them, the rugged beauty of mountains in the distance and the play of light on water nearby. But I don't miss feeling constrained by expectations, or having my worth determined solely by my marriageability. Keegan's mouth quirked upward. Not interested in marriage, then? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that made Selena's pulse quicken. I'm not opposed to marriage itself, she clarified, just to the idea that it should be a woman's only ambition or source of security. She met his gaze directly. I'd rather build something of my own first, prove to myself that I can succeed on my terms. If marriage comes after that, with the right person and for the right reasons, then I would welcome it. Keegan held her gaze, something intense and unreadable in his blue eyes. The right person and the right reasons, he repeated softly. That's a higher standard than most set out here, where practical considerations often outweigh romantic ones. Perhaps, Selena acknowledged, but I've never been one to settle for less than what I truly want. The air between them seemed to charge with possibility, and for a moment, Selena thought Keegan might lean forward, might close the small distance separating them beneath the cottonwood tree. But instead, he stood, offering her his hand to help her up. We should finish the fence, he said, his voice rougher than before. Storm clouds are building to the west. Selena accepted his hand, feeling the callous strength of it as he pulled her effortlessly to her feet. Their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary before Keegan released her and turned back to their work. They completed the fence as the first distant rumbles of thunder reached them, splitting the pool neatly in half with access for cattle from both properties. Standing back to survey their work, Selena felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the physical structure they had created. It's a good fence, Keegan declared, satisfaction evident in his tone. And a good solution. Better than feuding, Selena agreed with a smile. Keegan turned to her, his expression serious despite her lighter tone. I want you to know that whatever disagreements existed between our families before, they don't have to continue. I judge people on their own merits, not on old grudges. The sincerity in his voice touched Selena deeply. I feel the same way, she assured him. And based on your merits, Mr. Forrester, I'd say I'm fortunate to have you as a neighbor. A slow smile spread across Keegan's face, transforming his features in a way that made Selena's heart skip a beat. The fortune is mutual, Miss Odell. The thunder was closer now, and both of them glanced at the darkening western sky. We should head back, Keegan said reluctantly. That storm looks like it means business, and I doubt either of us wants to get caught in another flood so soon." Selena shuddered at the memory of being swept away by rushing water. "Definitely not," she agreed, moving toward her horse. Keegan helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The brief contact sent a warm current through Selena that had nothing to do with the humid air preceding the storm. "Will I see you in town for the Founders' Day celebration next weekend?" Keegan asked as he mounted his own horse. "The whole county turns out for it, and there's a dance in the evening." The invitation was casual but held an undercurrent of something more personal, and Selena found herself nodding before she had fully considered her answer. "I plan to be there," she said. "It will be my first Wickenburg social event." "Then I hope you'll save me a dance," Keegan said, the brim of his hat shadowing his face but not hiding the warmth in his eyes. "I will," Selena promised, her pulse quickening at the prospect. With that, they parted ways, each riding toward their respective properties as the storm clouds continued to gather. Selena could feel Keegan's gaze on her back as she rode away, and the knowledge brought a smile to her lips that lasted all the way home. The week leading up to the Founders' Day celebration was filled with work, as ranching always was, but Selena found her thoughts frequently drifting to Keegan and the dance he had mentioned. It had been over a year since she had attended any sort of formal social gathering, and she found herself looking forward to it with an anticipation that surprised her. The day before the celebration, Selena rode into Wickenburg to purchase supplies and found herself lingering outside the town's sole dress shop. She had brought several good dresses from Philadelphia, but they were Eastern styles, more formal and constrained than the practical clothing worn by most women in the territory. After a moment's hesitation, she entered the shop. Mrs. Holloway, the proprietor, greeted her warmly. "Miss Odell, what a pleasure to see you in town. Are you coming to the celebration tomorrow?" "I am," Selena confirmed, looking around at the selection of ready-made dresses and bolts of fabric. "And I find myself in need of something more suitable for the occasion than what I brought from back east, Mrs." Holloway's eyes lit up at the prospect of a sale. "I have just the thing," she declared, moving to a rack of dresses at the back of the shop. "This arrived last week from San Francisco, latest Western style, but with enough Eastern refinement to suit a lady of your background." She held up a dress of deep blue cotton, simply cut but with enough detail in the stitching and trim to make it appropriate for a special occasion. It was practical enough for the frontier but elegant enough to stand out at a dance. "It's lovely," Selena said honestly, reaching out to touch the fabric. "Try it on," Mrs. Holloway urged, gesturing toward a small fitting room curtained off in the corner. "I think it will suit you perfectly." The dress did indeed fit well, needing only minor adjustments to the hem and waist that Mrs. Holloway promised to complete by morning. As Selena admired her reflection in the shop's small mirror, she couldn't help but wonder what Keegan would think of her in the dress, and then immediately felt foolish for the thought. She was purchasing the dress for herself, not to impress a neighbor, no matter how compelling that neighbor might be. Yet as she left the shop with arrangements to collect the altered dress the next day, Selena had to admit to herself that her interest in Keegan Forrester had grown beyond mere neighborly feelings. The man who had ridden through a flood to save her, who had called her his to rescue, had somehow worked his way into her thoughts in a way no man ever had before. The revelation was both exhilarating and terrifying. Selena had come west to prove she could succeed independently, not to lose her heart to the first handsome cowboy who crossed her path. Yet there was something about Keegan that suggested a partnership with him would enhance her independence rather than diminish it. These thoughts occupied her mind as she completed her other errands in town, and it wasn't until she was nearly ready to leave that she spotted a familiar figure emerging from the general store. Keegan was loading supplies into a wagon, his back to her as she approached. "Need a hand with that?" she called, enjoying the way he turned quickly at the sound of her voice, his face brightening when he saw her. "Selena," he greeted her, setting down the sack of flour he had been about to load. "What brings you to town?" "Supplies, same as you," she replied, moving closer. "And I needed to order some fence posts to replace the sections washed away in the flood." Keegan nodded in understanding. "Flood repairs seem never-ending, don't they? I just finished replacing my chicken coop yesterday." "At least your chickens survived," Selena said with a rueful smile. "I'm down to 3 hens and a very confused rooster." This drew a laugh from Keegan, the sound rich and warm in the busy street. "I have extras if you need them," he offered. "My hens have been productive this spring." "That's very kind," Selena began, but Keegan waved away her thanks. "What are neighbors for?" he said simply. "Speaking of which, are you still planning to attend the celebration tomorrow?" "I am," Selena confirmed, suddenly aware of the curious glances they were receiving from passers-by. Wickenburg was a small community, and the sight of Jacob Odell's niece in friendly conversation with Keegan Forrester was bound to raise eyebrows given the history between their families. Keegan seemed to notice the attention as well, but appeared unconcerned by it. "Good," he said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm looking forward to that dance you promised me." Before Selena could respond, a voice called out from across the street. "Forrester, got a minute?" Keegan turned to see the town sheriff, a stocky man with an impressive mustache, beckoning to him. "Be right there, Sheriff," he called back, then turned to Selena with an apologetic expression. "Duty calls." "Of course," Selena nodded, trying to hide her disappointment at the interruption. "I'll see you tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," Keegan agreed, his voice holding a promise that warmed Selena from within despite the hot Arizona sun beating down on them. As she mounted her horse and began the ride back to her ranch, Selena couldn't help but feel that something significant was building between them, something that tomorrow's celebration might bring to light. The following evening, Selena stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, making final adjustments to her appearance. The blue dress from Mrs. Holloway's shop fit perfectly, highlighting the auburn of her hair and the green of her eyes. She had styled her hair simply but elegantly, with loose curls framing her face while the rest was pinned up in a style that was practical for dancing. "Miss Odell," Tobias's voice called from downstairs. "The wagon's ready whenever you are. Coming." Selena called back, taking one last look at her reflection before heading downstairs. Tobias, dressed in his Sunday best, waited by the door. His eyebrows rose appreciatively at the sight of her in the new dress. "You look mighty fine, miss. Wickenburg won't know what hit it." Selena laughed, touched by the compliment from her usually taciturn foreman. "Thank you, Tobias. You look quite handsome yourself." The older man ducked his head in embarrassment but offered his arm to escort her to the waiting wagon. 2 more of her ranch hands, also cleaned up for the occasion, sat in the back of the wagon and tipped their hats as she approached. The ride into town was filled with anticipation, not just Selena's but that of her men as well. Founders' Day was one of the few occasions when work stopped completely, allowing everyone to enjoy a day of celebration and community. Wickenburg was transformed when they arrived, the main street decorated with bunting and lanterns that cast a warm glow in the gathering dusk. A platform had been erected in the town square for speeches and musical performances, and tables laden with food lined one side of the open area where the dance would take place. People from all over the county had gathered, creating a festive atmosphere that was infectious. Selena found herself swept into conversations with neighbors she had only briefly met before, all curious about the woman who had taken over the Double O Ranch. She was speaking with the banker's wife when she felt a prickling awareness at the back of her neck. Turning, she saw Keegan making his way through the crowd toward her. He was dressed more formally than she had seen him before, in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and string tie, his usual cowboy hat replaced by a more formal Stetson. The effect was striking, highlighting the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his build. "Miss Odell," he greeted her when he reached her side, tipping his hat. "You look beautiful tonight." The simple compliment, delivered with such evident sincerity, brought warmth to Selena's cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester. You clean up rather well yourself." The banker's wife, Mrs. Peterson, looked between them with undisguised interest. "Well, isn't this a pleasant surprise?" she observed. Jacob Odell and Martin Forrester would hardly believe their eyes, seeing their heirs getting along so famously. Keegan's expression remained polite, but Selena could see a hint of tension around his eyes at the mention of their family's feud. "Times change, Mrs. Peterson," he said smoothly. "And Miss Odell and I have found more in common than differences." "Indeed," Selena agreed, wanting to move past the awkward topic. "Mr. Forrester has been an invaluable neighbor, especially during the recent flood." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened. "Yes, I heard about your ordeal." "How fortunate that Mr. Forrester found you when he did." "Very fortunate," Selena confirmed, exchanging a look with Keegan that conveyed far more than her words. The town mayor's voice boomed out from the platform then, calling for everyone's attention as the official ceremonies began. Keegan offered his arm to Selena. "Shall we find a place to listen to the speeches?" Grateful for the interruption, Selena placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his shirt. "Lead the way." They found a spot at the edge of the crowd, close enough to hear but far enough to speak privately if they wished. As the mayor droned on about the founding of Wickenburg and its prosperous future, Keegan leaned closer to Selena. "I meant what I said," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "You look stunning tonight." Selena turned her head slightly to meet his gaze, their faces closer than propriety strictly allowed. "Thank you," she said softly. "I must admit, I was hoping you would approve." Something kindled in Keegan's eyes at her admission. "I more than approve," he assured her, his voice low and intimate. The heat in his gaze sent a shiver down Selena's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. They stood in charged silence after that, barely hearing the remainder of the speeches as each became acutely aware of the other's presence. When the formal part of the celebration ended and the musicians began to tune their instruments for the dance, Keegan turned to Selena with a question in his eyes. "You promised me a dance," he reminded her. "I hope you're still willing." "I am," Selena confirmed, her pulse quickening at the prospect of being in his arms, even in the socially acceptable context of a dance. The musicians struck up a lively reel, and couples began to form on the cleared area that served as a dance floor. Keegan led Selena to join them, his hand warm and sure at the small of her back. As they took their positions across from each other, Selena found herself caught in Keegan's intense blue gaze. The dance began, and they moved together with an ease that belied the fact that they had never danced together before. Keegan was surprisingly graceful for a man who spent his days on horseback, and Selena matched his movements with the skill gained from years of dancing lessons in Philadelphia. "You dance well," she observed during a brief moment when they came together in the pattern of the reel. "My mother's influence," Keegan explained as they circled each other. "She insisted I learn, said it would serve me well someday." Wise woman, Selena smiled, enjoying the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he returned her smile. The reel gave way to a waltz, and Keegan drew Selena into his arms without hesitation. The more intimate dance brought them closer together, his hand at her waist and hers on his shoulder, their other hands clasped together. The proper distance between them seemed to shrink with each turn around the floor, until Selena could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I've been thinking about you," Keegan admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "More than is probably wise." The confession sent a thrill through Selena. "I've been thinking about you too," she replied, matching his honesty with her own. Keegan's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Where does that leave us?" It was a direct question, typical of his straightforward nature, and Selena appreciated that he didn't play games or speak in riddles. "I'm not entirely sure," she answered truthfully. "I came west to establish myself independently, not to." She trailed off, uncertain how to express the complexity of her feelings. "Not to fall for your neighbor," Keegan supplied, a hint of humor in his voice despite the seriousness of the conversation. "Exactly," Selena confirmed, grateful for his understanding. "Yet here we are." "Here we are," Keegan agreed, guiding her through a graceful turn. "For what it's worth, I didn't plan this either. But since that day I found you on those rocks in the flood, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind." The waltz ended, and they stood still for a moment as other couples moved around them, neither quite ready to break the connection they had formed. Finally, Keegan spoke again, his voice husky with emotion. "Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Curiosity piqued, Selena nodded. "Lead the way." Keegan guided her away from the dancing area, through the crowd and toward the edge of town. They walked in comfortable silence, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. The sounds of the celebration faded behind them as Keegan led her to a small hill overlooking the town. From this vantage point, Wickenburg was a collection of lights in the gathering darkness, the music from the dance a distant melody carried on the evening breeze. "This is one of my favorite spots," Keegan said, stopping at the crest of the hill. "My father used to bring me here when I was a boy to watch the stars come out." Selena looked up at the vast expanse of sky above them, already speckled with the first bright stars of evening. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It helps remind me of my place in the world," Keegan explained, his voice thoughtful. "Big enough to matter, small enough to stay humble." The philosophy struck Selena as profoundly right, encapsulating something she had been trying to define since coming west. "I like that way of thinking," she told him, turning to face him fully. In the soft light of dusk, Keegan's features were cast in gentle shadows, but his eyes remained bright as they met hers. "Selena," he said her name like a caress. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel like I've been waiting for you without even knowing it." The words, spoken with such simple honesty, touched something deep within Selena. "I feel the same way," she admitted, taking a step closer to him. "It's as if the flood that nearly took my life instead brought me something I didn't even know I was missing." Keegan reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "When I rode into that water and saw you stranded on those rocks, something inside me just knew. You were mine to save, mine to protect." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "And maybe, if you're willing, mine to love." The declaration hung in the air between them, bold and vulnerable all at once. Selena's heart raced as she covered his hand with her own, holding it against her face. "I think I'd like that," she whispered, "to be yours, and for you to be mine." Keegan's eyes darkened at her words, and he closed the remaining distance between them, his free arm encircling her waist to draw her against him. "May I kiss you, Selena Odell?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Selena raised herself on tiptoe, her hands moving to his shoulders as she brought her lips to his. The kiss began gently, a tender exploration that quickly deepened as years of independence and loneliness melted away in the heat of shared desire. Keegan's arms tightened around her, lifting her slightly as he angled his head to deepen the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Selena kept her hands on his shoulders, unwilling to release him completely. "That was worth waiting for," she said with a small, breathless laugh. Keegan smiled, the expression transforming his face in the gathering darkness. "The first of many, I hope," he replied, pressing his forehead against hers. "Many," Selena agreed, feeling a sense of rightness that transcended logic or reason. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever adjustments they would need to make to bridge their separate lives, she knew with certainty that this man, this honorable, straightforward cowboy who had ridden through a flood to save her, was meant to be part of her future. They remained on the hilltop for some time, talking softly and stealing kisses under the star-filled sky, before reluctantly returning to the celebration. As they walked back, hand in hand, Selena reflected that she had indeed found what she came west for: independence. Yes, but also a connection to the land and to a man who valued her strength rather than seeing it as a threat. And when Keegan had called her his in that moment of rescue, perhaps he had seen a truth that was only now becoming clear to both of them. Some floods wash away what was, while others bring exactly what is needed. In her case, the raging waters had carried her not to destruction, but to a new beginning in the arms of a man who had braved the current to reach her. As spring turned to summer, Selena and Keegan's courtship became the talk of Wickenburg. What had begun with a daring rescue had blossomed into a relationship that defied the expectations of a community accustomed to the feud between their families. They were seen together at church on Sundays, riding the boundaries of their adjoining properties, and occasionally sharing meals at the town's small restaurant. For Selena, these months were a revelation. She had never expected to find a partner who respected her independence while offering support when she needed it. Keegan consulted her on ranching decisions, valuing her insight despite her relative inexperience, and taught her the skills she needed without condescension. In return, Selena brought a fresh perspective to problems Keegan had faced for years, suggesting innovations he might not have considered. Their shared fence and water access at Sycamore Creek became a model for resolving similar disputes in the territory, with neighboring ranchers often seeking their advice on boundary issues. July brought scorching heat to the Arizona territory, with temperatures that baked the earth and tested the endurance of man and beast alike. Water became even more precious, and both Selena and Keegan spent long days ensuring their cattle had access to adequate drinking sources. It was on one such day, as Selena rode the eastern boundary of her property checking water levels, that she came upon Keegan doing the same on his side. They met at the shared fence line, both dismounting in the shade of a lone cottonwood that had somehow found enough moisture to thrive in the arid landscape. "Didn't expect to see you out here today," Keegan greeted her, reaching across the fence to take her hand. "Thought you were headed into town for supplies. Changed my plans when I saw how low the creek was running," Selena explained, enjoying the feel of his calloused fingers against hers. "Wanted to check all the watering holes before deciding if we need to move the herd closer to the main creek." Keegan nodded in approval. "Smart thinking. I've been doing the same." He glanced up at the merciless sun. "This heat's not breaking anytime soon, according to old Jim Peterson. Says his rheumatism tells him we're in for at least another week of it." Selena smiled at the mention of the town's unofficial weather prophet. And his rheumatism is never wrong, or so I'm told. Never, Keegan confirmed with mock seriousness before his expression softened. You look beautiful today, even with that hat shading half your face. The compliment brought color to Selena's cheeks. After months of courtship, Keegan still had the ability to make her blush with his direct admiration. You're biased, she countered, but squeezed his hand in thanks nonetheless. Proudly so, Keegan agreed, tugging her hand to draw her closer to the fence that separated them. I've been thinking, Selena, he began, his tone shifting to something more serious. A dangerous pastime, she teased, but her heart had begun to beat faster at the look in his eyes. Very dangerous, he agreed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Especially when what I've been thinking about is how much I hate saying goodbye to you at the end of each day. Selena's breath caught at the implication of his words. I don't much care for it either, she admitted softly. Keegan reached into his pocket with his free hand and withdrew a small object that glinted in the sunlight. I had this made in Phoenix, he explained, holding up a simple but elegant gold ring. It's not fancy like what you might have had back east, but it's perfect, Selena interrupted, her eyes fixed on the ring that represented everything she had never expected to find in the West. Keegan's eyes held hers, intense and unwavering. I love you, Selena Odell. I've loved you since I pulled you from those floodwaters, maybe even from the moment I saw you stranded on those rocks, looking like a half-drowned cat, but still fighting with everything you had. He smiled at the memory. Will you marry me? Be my partner in everything, life, love, land, all of it. Tears pricked at Selena's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, Keegan Forrester. Despite the fence between them, Keegan managed to slip the ring onto her finger, then vaulted over the barrier in one fluid movement to take her properly into his arms. The kiss they shared was both a seal on their promise and a preview of the passion they would soon be free to explore fully as husband and wife. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Keegan rested his forehead against hers. I was thinking we could combine our ranches, he said. The Double O and my place together would make one of the most viable operations in the county. The suggestion made perfect sense, both romantically and practically. The Double F Ranch, Selena mused, considering the combination of their initials. Keegan shook his head. I was thinking the Sycamore Ranch, he countered. Named after the creek that once divided us but now brings us together. A fresh start without the weight of either family's past. The thoughtfulness behind his suggestion touched Selena deeply. Sycamore Ranch, she repeated, testing the name. I like it. They remained under the cottonwood for some time, making plans for their future together, and sharing kisses that grew increasingly difficult to keep within the bounds of propriety. Finally, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, they reluctantly parted, each needing to return to their respective ranches to complete the day's tasks. Dinner at my place tomorrow, Selena suggested as they mounted their horses. I'll tell Tobias and the others about our engagement. Keegan nodded, his eyes still heated from their earlier embraces. I'll be there. And Selena, he added as she turned her horse toward home, wear that ring proudly. I want everyone to know you're mine just as I'm yours. The possessiveness in his voice sent a pleasant shiver down Selena's spine. I will, she promised, touching the gold band that now encircled her finger. Until tomorrow, my love. The ride back to her ranch was filled with plans and dreams for their shared future. As Selena approached her property, she could see Tobias and two other hands working on the corral fence. They looked up at her approach, and Tobias raised a hand in greeting. Miss Odell. he called as she dismounted. "Everything all right at the east boundary?" "Everything is perfect, Tobias," Selena replied, unable to keep the joy from her voice. She held out her left hand, the ring catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Mr. Forrester has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted." Tobias's weathered face broke into a rare, genuine smile. "Well now, that's the best news I've heard in a long while," he declared, stepping forward to take her hand and examine the ring. "Congratulations, miss. Mr. Forrester is a good man." "The best," Selena agreed, touched by the foreman's obvious approval. "He'll be joining us for dinner tomorrow evening so we can discuss the future of the ranch." Tobias nodded, understanding the implications immediately. "Combining the properties?" "Yes," Selena confirmed. "We'll be calling it Sycamore Ranch, a fresh start for both of us." "A good name," Tobias approved, "and a smart move. Together, you'll have one of the strongest operations in the territory." The other hands offered their congratulations as well, and by supper time, everyone at the 00 knew of the engagement. Selena went to bed that night with a heart full of joy, and a mind busy with plans for the future she would build with Keegan. The wedding took place in October, when the worst of the summer heat had passed, and the landscape was painted in the golden hues of autumn. They chose to hold the ceremony outdoors, at the bend in Sycamore Creek, that had once been the source of dispute between their families, and was now the symbolic heart of their united property. The entire town of Wickenburg turned out for the occasion, along with ranchers and their families from throughout the county. Even Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife who had commented on their family's feud at the Founders' Day celebration, remarked that it was the most romantic thing to happen in the territory in 20 years. Selena wore a gown of ivory silk that she had ordered from San Francisco, simple in design but elegant in execution. Her auburn hair was adorned with wildflowers gathered that morning, and she carried a bouquet of the same blooms as she walked toward Keegan on Tobias's arm, the older man having agreed to give her away in the absence of any family. Keegan waited for her beneath an arch constructed of branches from the cottonwood tree where he had proposed, dressed in a new black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his build. His eyes never left Selena as she approached, and the love in them was so evident that several women in the assembled crowd dabbed at tears. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with vows they had written themselves that spoke of partnership, respect, and enduring love. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Keegan's kiss was both tender and possessive, a public claiming that brought cheers from their friends and neighbors. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food, music, and dancing under the stars. As the evening wore on, Keegan drew Selena away from the crowd, leading her to a quiet spot overlooking the creek. "Happy, Mrs. Forrester?" he asked, his arms encircling her from behind as they gazed out at the water that reflected the moon's silver light. "Completely," Selena assured him, leaning back against his solid warmth. "And you, Mr. Forrester? Any regrets about tying yourself to a stubborn Eastern woman who insisted on running a ranch by herself?" Keegan chuckled, the sound vibrating against her back. "Not a single one," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below her ear. "Though I'm looking forward to showing you just how much I don't regret it once we're alone." The promise in his voice sent heat coursing through Selena's body, and she turned in his arms to face him. "Perhaps we should make our excuses and retire for the evening," she suggested, her voice husky with anticipation. Keegan's eyes darkened at her words, and he captured her lips in a kiss that left no doubt about his own eagerness to begin their life together in every sense. "I've been waiting to hear those words all day," he admitted when they finally broke apart. They returned to the celebration long enough to thank their guests and receive final congratulations before departing for the house that would now be their shared home. Keegan had insisted on carrying Selena across the threshold, a tradition she had laughingly called old-fashioned but secretly found endearing. Inside, candles had been lit in anticipation of their arrival, casting a warm, golden glow over the bedroom. Selena felt a moment's nervousness despite her independent nature. She was still a product of her upbringing, and physical intimacy was something discussed only in whispers among the women she had known in Philadelphia. Keegan sensed her hesitation and approached her with gentle hands, his touch respectful even as desire darkened his eyes. "We have all night," he assured her, carefully removing the flowers from her hair. "All of our lives, in fact. There's no rush." His consideration eased Selena's anxiety, and she reached up to loosen his tie, then unbutton his vest. "I may be inexperienced," she told him with a small smile, "but I'm a quick learner." Keegan's answering grin was both wolfish and tender. "I'm counting on it," he replied, bending to kiss her again as their wedding night began in earnest. The years that followed proved the wisdom of their decision to unite their lives and lands. Sycamore Ranch prospered under their joint management, with Keegan's experience complemented by Selena's innovative thinking. They expanded their operation to include not just cattle, but also horses, developing a breeding program that produced mounts known throughout the territory for their intelligence and endurance. Their personal happiness was equally abundant. 2 years after their wedding, Selena gave birth to a son they named Martin Jacob, honoring both their fathers. A daughter, Elizabeth Rose, followed 3 years later, her arrival coinciding with Arizona's transition from territory to statehood in 1912. Through droughts and abundant years, through challenges and triumphs, the partnership formed when a cowboy rode through floodwaters to rescue a woman stranded on the rocks remained unshakable. They worked side by side, raised their children with love and respect for the land that sustained them, and built a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of their ranch. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Keegan surprised Selena with a small silver box. Inside was a piece of the rock from where he had found her during the flood, mounted as a paperweight with their initials, and the date of his rescue engraved on a silver plate. "To remind us where it all began," he explained as she turned the memento over in her hands, tears welling in her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "As if I could ever forget," Selena replied, setting the paperweight aside to wrap her arms around the man who had claimed her heart that day by calling her his, even when they were strangers. "That flood tried to take my life, but instead, it gave me everything I never knew I wanted." Keegan's arms tightened around her, still strong despite the passing years. "I thank God every day that I found you on those rocks," he murmured against her hair, now streaked with the first strands of silver, "and that you were stubborn enough to hold on until I got there." "Always," Selena promised, lifting her face for his kiss. "I'll always hold on for you, Keegan Forrester." And so they continued, their love as enduring as the land they had united, their story becoming part of the rich tapestry of legends that defined the American West, where a flash flood could strand a woman on the rocks, and a cowboy could ride through the current to claim her as his own, not as a possession, but as an equal partner in all things, forever bound by the waters that had brought them together.